Thank you everyone for joining us today while we talk about accounting process. This is not something that's near and dear to everybody's heart, but over the years in my work as a CPA in public accounting and private accounting, it's become something that I find is an incredibly useful tool and very helpful. So I hope by the time you're done with today's presentation, you'll feel a little bit of that same feeling that I have felt. Our learning objectives today, we'd like to help you understand the many reasons it's important to document key accounting processes. You may know a few of them, but we might give you an insight into a few more. We want to help you realize how investing a little time in documentation up front will save you big time and money in the long run. We're going to help you learn some simple and efficient ways to begin the process for you and your staff. Sometimes I think people understand it's important, they'd like to get started, but just the actual getting started is a little bit tricky. So we'll help you with that. And then we'll review some sample templates of good process documentation. And at the end of the webinar, we will also provide you with some of those templates to work. So as I mentioned, if you are interested in CPE credit, you will need to answer these polling questions. So here's our number one polling question. Why are you interested in this topic? Are you a CFO? Are you in the finance office, but not the CFO? Not in the finance office, but interested in your own area for documentation? Eide Bailly staff or other public accounting firm staff? We'll give you a few minutes to answer that, and we do need a certain level of participation, so please do answer this question even if you're not in this for CPE.
Alrighty, everyone. You will answer this question from right on your screen. If you have maximized your media player, please minimize that and make sure your slides box is maximized where you can answer the polling question. And then if you are unable to see the submit button, scroll down just a bit, and then you will be able to submit your answer. And please make sure you are submitting your answers on the screen. You'll select A, B, C, D, or E, and then hit submit. Answering your question in the Q&A box does not qualify for CPE, so please make sure you are answering the question from right on the screen. Alrighty, and Cathy, we are good to continue.
Okay, great. So I mentioned we hope to help you understand why it's important to care about documenting key accounting processes, but I'd like to share with you a little bit about why I care about this and some of the lessons that I've learned as I've worked through my career in public and private accounting. So as a temporary CFO and controller, which is work I'm doing for Eide Bailly right now, I have learned stepping into a position where a CFO or a controller has left that if there is no trail or documentation, you are learning on the fly, so to speak. I find that there's confusion among the accounting staff. Who does this? Who does what? People have a lot of stress about things falling through the crack because there's no documentation about who is responsible for some of the key processes. And then I think one of the most important things was I saw organizations losing corporate history. If there is more than one turnover in a finance department over just a short period of time, you're finding that some of the corporate stories are going to be lost, maybe permanently. I've also worked in private accounting as a CFO, and what I found, the lack of documentation there meant that every time there was staff turnover, you had a potential for a big hole. I found staff often didn't know why they were doing the process. They were just doing the same as last year, Sally, or the same as the person who had done it before them, but they didn't understand why they were doing it. I found that not having documentation meant staff could easily work in silos, and then that meant there was a lack of synergy between different staff, and there was also no opportunity for cross-training because nothing was written down. You had to be working with the person to even learn anything about their job, and often there just wasn't time to do that. Work for me, review work, very time consuming. If I didn't understand where, why, because the staff didn't understand where or why, it just meant a lot more question asking for me. And then I think one of the key things that really made me think it was unfortunate not to have documentation was the limit on staff growth opportunities. If you don't see where your pieces fit into the overall puzzle, you're just not going to realize where your part of the puzzle could be wrong, first of all, but also how will you ever know if you'd like to work on another area of the company or the organization? How will you know if you don't see the whole puzzle, if you'd like to work in a different area? And then again, we should all care about good documentation, I believe, because it shows if accounting transactions are recorded correctly. Putting it in writing can really highlight potential issues. When you write something down and read through it, you or your boss or the controller or CFO might see that there is a lack of segregation of duties. There might be some internal control issues. Written documentation can also help you track key accounting elections. I've been in many organizations where the only way people know about the key accounting elections is if they read the audit footnotes. But those key accounting elections need to be documented somewhere, and within your processes is an excellent place for that to happen. Documentation helps when you have staff turnover. It captures that corporate history that I said I often saw lost. It facilitates training. Now you have a roadmap for your staff to follow, your new person coming in. And it's an opportunity, as I mentioned, for growth and training. Somebody can cross-train in another area, maybe find that they're interested in payroll or they're interested in accounts receivable. With that documentation, they can understand how that job works, and maybe if that job opens up, they'll want to apply for it. And then documentation really presents the bigger picture. It identifies process inefficiencies, as I mentioned, maybe potential internal control deficiencies, and it will help you identify interdepartmental synergies. So let's lay some ground rules and best practices for documentation in general before we get started on some specific examples. Documentation is simply a set of instructions. Think about putting together a bookcase from IKEA or making a recipe. This is going to be your recipe. You're going to document an accounting process with general steps. This documentation is separate from specific expertise or software training. For example, if you're documenting how to set up a vendor AP, a vendor in your AP module, you're going to assume the staff person reading the documentation has some general expertise or knowledge in the AP area and some software training. The process documentation for the vendor setup then can focus on the specific steps. We don't want your documentation to become another software manual, and it shouldn't be an instruction manual or an accounting manual for how accounts payable works. It's documenting specific steps in a process. There are 4 good elements of any good documentation. First one is it's clearly written and easily understandable. You will want to avoid the use of acronyms unless you spell the acronym out the first time you use it. Then you can use the acronym after that. You want to, again, assume that there's going to be a general knowledge of the reader, but if you think you're getting too technical or you're too general in nature, have someone else read it and give you their opinion. If it's clearly written and easily understandable, then somebody else in the finance area should be able to read it and comprehend it. The second element is concise. We're not writing a Wikipedia entry or an encyclopedia back in the day. We're trying to write something that is a little bit more concise than that and is a general overview of the steps. We want it to be correct. You write it down and then you walk through the documentation to test it out. It's actually kind of challenging when you first start doing this to get all the steps of everything that you do. But once you've done it a little while, you'll really get into the swing of it, and you'll find that it's easier for you to think in terms of process. And that in itself is an additional benefit of writing down the documentation. And finally, current. You want your documentation to be reviewed at least annually. It should be reviewed if you have staff turnover. It should be reviewed if you have a major change in your software or if you would reorganize your department. That will keep your documentation current. So the triggers are usually year-end is a good time to review, but think about those other major changes in your organization that are an ideal opportunity to review the documentation. Some other helpful tips. You're going to want to document the classic who, what, when, where, and why. So the who is your organization and the person preparing it. The what is the name of the process. The when is when does this process occur? Is it a monthly process, quarterly, annually, weekly, daily? The where refers to where in your accounting cycle does this process happen. So for example, some processes cannot happen until the step before that has occurred. So for example, you can't reconcile your bank statement until you have your bank statement from the bank. So the bank statement available from your bank is a trigger for your bank reconciliation. Your bank reconciliation is then a trigger for subsequent steps. Think in terms, if your organization uses a monthly checklist for month-end financial statements or quarter-end processes, year-end processes, where in that checklist does this process fall? Because that's going to determine what you have to wait for to happen first and how the processes that come after this fall into the whole cycle. And finally, the why. Why are you doing this process? Well, my boss says I have to do it. It might be needed for the financial statement presentation. It might be in conjunction with a policy that you have that you need to have this process completed. But document the why we're doing this. And it can be just as simple as need this for month-end financials. The second thing to think about for a tip is your method. And I don't want you to get too bogged down in this, because I think sometimes people spend a lot of time thinking, oh my gosh, how should I do this, rather than just choosing a method and getting started. You can always change your method later on. I suggest just starting simple. I'm a big fan of documenting in a spreadsheet, in a Word doc. You can use the software, but it doesn't matter the method as much as it matters to do it. And then once you've selected a method, develop some templates for everyone to follow. And if you're going to go through the agony of deciding how you want things to look or how you want the documentation process to be, set a template up, and then nobody else has to go through the same grief. With that, we're going to move on to our second polling question. What do you think your biggest challenge will be in documenting your organization's processes? I find a common answer is just finding time to do it. Also, people feel like they need some more knowledge or understanding of it. And a common one is resistance within the organization. And that resistance might be because people think this takes a lot of time, or I don't know how to do this. If you're the head of your department, if you're the controller or the CFO who's going to spearhead this process, we hope that you'll find the tools on this today to get that knowledge and convince people that they will actually end up saving time if they do this documentation.
All right, everyone. And remember, please answer the questions on the screen. Select A, B, or C on the screen. Putting your question in the Q&A box does not count for CPE. You actually have to answer the question that is on your screen and then scroll down just a bit and hit submit. And we'll leave this up for a few more moments and then we will continue.
And I know I mentioned this, but if you have questions as we're going through the presentation and you want to put them in the chat, when we come to these polling questions, we'll answer them as we have time or at the end.
All right, Cathy, and we are good to continue.
Okay. So now we have some general guidelines, some rules for what documentation is and things you need to keep in mind. So let's talk about how you're going to start identifying processes to document. It can seem overwhelming if you have to think about your whole set of processes within your department. So let's figure out how to identify the ones to start. You should be looking for processes that have the highest risk to your organization. If this process didn't get done, what would happen? I mean, that's a question that you can ask. We need this process because if we don't get it done, we can't do financials, or we can't do the tax return, or we can't present this report. The urgent ones as well might be urgent because you have staff turnover coming up, and that might kick the documentation for that area into the forefront. And also look at the ones that are the most challenging to understand. I always think about the Stephen Covey quadrants. You know, there are the fires to put out. That's the urgent ones. There are those high risk ones. And then those challenging ones to understand. These might not be urgent, but in the biggest picture, they're very difficult. If you did have staff turnover in this area, this would be where you would want to pick that staff's brain and see how that process worked before they left. So those are three areas that you can think about when you're trying to identify these processes to start. One way I like to identify processes is by having my staff list out the duties that they do. So a staff task list is simply your staff taking a piece of paper or keeping a computer log somewhere where they can log the activities that they do daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annually. I have them keep a page for each one of these and just start writing them down over the course of a couple of weeks. It seems like a tough thing to get started on in one sense, but once they start going through like 1 month of accounting cycles, or if they start looking at some of their year-end work papers or their quarterly reports that they have to file, they'll start developing these lists pretty well. And don't rush them on this, because these lists are going to be things will keep coming to mind as they start populating these lists. And also have your staff review the audit walkthroughs that you do with your audit, your walkthroughs of key processes. Those are going to identify processes and help your staff understand what might need to be added to those annual walkthroughs. I'm a big fan of these staff lists as a starting point for a number of reasons. I think that identifying the key processes from these lists, it will help you pick out those highest risk, most urgent, and most challenging to understand. And I think your staff, when they start looking at the regular work papers and the reconciliations that they do, they can start considering adding a process tab right to those reconciliation work papers, especially in Excel. We'll go through an example of this. That's a great way to very easily and almost painlessly incorporate documentation into a worksheet so that it's right there when you open up that worksheet the next time for updating. If you're going to use this approach, I really recommend you establish a schedule with your staff. Sit down with them, talk about the importance of this. This isn't just some sort of crazy brain exercise that you came up with that'll disappear next week. You'll want to sit down, get buy-in from them, assign the task list documentation, and establish a deadline for everybody to have it to you. And you can also consider a group session to get started. People sometimes find this is fun, sit down over cookies and coffee or something like that, and bounce ideas off each other. And it makes this a little less foreign a process for your staff to work on as they get going. Here's an example of a staff task list for an AP accountant. This task list is for the AP accountant. Jenny prepared it, and it was last updated March 2023. These are important things to keep in mind, because these task lists, as I'm sure you're all aware, can get outdated very quickly, especially if you have turnover in your office. So Jenny listed out the daily tasks that she does. Most of your daily tasks might not involve process documentation. These are more just the routine things that you would do, answering questions, things like that. When you get into some of Jenny's weekly tasks, you're going to start finding things that might be a higher priority for documentation. And then certainly when you get into the monthly tasks, contacting vendors with credit balances, reconciling AP to general ledger is probably one that would be good for documentation. Your monthly tax reporting, that's something that would be urgent at month end. You'd want to make sure, and might be challenging to understand if you have multiple tax situations, tax states that you're reporting in. And then definitely when you get to the quarterly and annual, you are going to find these are going to be important processes to document, simply because you only do them quarterly or annually. So the ability to forget steps in one of these processes just because you don't do them as frequently is going to be higher. That makes them higher risk and a better candidate for process documentation. So this is probably a shorter list than you'll have with most of your staff when they sit down. But again, just have them start these lists. And then once everybody gets to a point where they think that they're in pretty good shape, you would want to sit down as controller or CFO and review these lists with them and help them decide which they think should be documented and which you think should be documented. There are really great other benefits to these task lists. I always like to do them to look at job descriptions. So it's like, here's what Jenny's doing. Here's what Jenny's job description says. Gosh, they don't relate at all. Or Jenny has had job creep and has picked up these 5 tasks from somebody else and they're not in her job description. Do we even want them in her job description? Is this an internal control issue with the lack of segregation of duties? I find that that task list comes across very handy just to look at those job descriptions as well. And then I also think this is a good way if you don't have a calendar of important due dates in your office, monthly, quarterly, annual due dates, report filing deadlines, things like that, you can start developing it with the calendar that you calendar the items that are on your staff task lists and start developing a business office calendar of important due dates. There are a couple of other great ways to identify key processes if you don't want to take this task list approach. Look at your internal control walkthroughs that you go through with your auditor during the audit process. Those are key processes. I mean, that's why the auditors want to see how they operate. So look at what you might want to document within those processes. And then look at key reconciliation work papers you're doing monthly, quarterly, or annually, because those will often be something that have multiple steps involved in them, require multiple reports be run. Those are good things to document as well. So now that we've got some general ground rules, we've kind of decided where you would want to start with documenting processes. Let's actually talk about documenting a process. I'm going to emphasize again, choose what works for you. For a standalone process, Word and Excel templates are fine. One of my favorites, which we will walk through, is adding that process sheet to a work paper, a separate tab in there that says, here's how I'm doing this work paper, and it's going to list a bunch of important and helpful information. And if you have a very complicated set of processes or you really feel like you need assistance, you can look to firms for external assistance through consulting and through software programs. Even if you do that, I would suggest that you just test the waters a little bit on your own to understand just how documentation works. And then when you work with a consultant or an external software, you'll have a better idea of how you want to proceed. So let's take an example. I'm going to share my screen here. Here is an example of the do-good organizations, contributions receivable that they do every year end. They're reconciling their contributions receivable from their donor report. And then as you can see, we've made a couple of adjusting entries to that, and we're coming up with a final contributions receivable amount, which should tie to this general ledger account. What I have done is, as you can see at the bottom of this worksheet, we have a tab for the contributions receivable, a tab for the allowance calculation, and there's also a tab that says pledge detail report. I have simply added a tab in the front that has the process documentation. This is such an easy and almost painless way to start your documentation. When you're doing the reconciliation, write down the steps. When in the next month, you can review it and go through the steps again and see what you might have missed. But you're just doing it side by side at the same time, and it just catches so much great information right away. So again, we've got our do-good organization, contributions receivable. I've got it labeled up here. This is the process for the contributions receivable and the allowance reconciliation. The area that this falls under is receivables, and the responsible person is the advancement accountant. The purpose of this worksheet, why are we doing this? To reconcile the detailed pledge report to the general ledger and establish an allowance. When do we reconcile this? We reconcile the GL pledges quarterly, and the allowance is reviewed at least annually. I talk about the step in the close process. I mentioned if you have a monthly or quarterly checklist, this would identify where that falls in the process. So here I just referenced that quarterly and monthly checklist. And now I'm going into the actual process steps. I have a section for the pledge detail tab, the contributions receivable tab. The pledge detail is that pledge detail report. One for the contributions receivable worksheet and one for the allowance worksheet. And I just put them in this order because this is the order things go. You have to run the pledge detail report first, and it gives you some cautions on that. It says run it by this period due date, include all pledges. Here are the print report parameters that I use. Anybody who works with donor software knows that those pledge reports will give you just about anything you want. If you want some consistent information for a reconciliation like this, write the report parameters down here. Export the report to Excel. And now we're going to review it with the Vice President for Advancement and determine if there are pledges that should not be on here, if there are past due pledges that we don't think are collectible. And we're also going to review, this is the policy of this organization, any pledge greater than $100,000 to make sure that it has been properly recorded, it doesn't have conditions that restrict or restrictions that have not been properly recorded. So we're reviewing basically our input information here, and these are pretty key steps. If you're going to have any kind of contributions receivable that are meaningful on your financial statements, this input information has to be good. The report has to be run correctly, and you need to review the data within the report. So once we've got the pledge report, now we can go to our contributions receivable tab, and we're going to enter the contributions receivable from that pledge report detail as adjusted perhaps. We're going to make those adjustments that we talked about with the advancement VP. And then we also say when we get done, this adjusted total should tie to the general ledger. Not a small step. It's amazing how many reconciliation papers get all the way done. When you compare them to the final numbers in your general ledger, they don't tie. So this is an important step to teach your staff and to have them checking. And if they don't match, here's a couple of hints on how you might be able to reconcile it or find it. This is great because now you're capturing that corporate history. It's like, oh yeah, check that the pledge report didn't include this, or check this in the general ledger to make sure nobody posted there. This is where some of that great corporate history that will help you reconcile your accounts more quickly will carry over in this process documentation tab. And finally, we have the same kind of process instructions for your allowance tab. Here I've got U.S. University instead of Do Good Organization. I guess I had a couple of different organizations that I was working with here, but their policy is to write off any pledges deemed 100% uncollectible. Past due pledges considered collectible have an allowance calculated based on historical percentages. These are accounting elections and policies the organization has made, and you are now documenting that on here. Now everybody knows them and understands them. Anybody who looks at this worksheet will see what those policies are. And if the policy changes during the year, the person reviewing this worksheet is going to say, hey, wait, whoops, that policy changed. Now we're not writing them off unless we're writing anything off that's only 50% collectible or something like that. And again, we've got the individual steps. We're going to enter the pledges, enter adjustments. We're going to subtotal. It should tie back to this tab. And now we're going to apply the collection percentages. And again, we'll compare the ending balance to the general ledger. And at the very bottom of this worksheet, as you can see, I have also printed off the location of this worksheet so that if you print a hard copy of this worksheet off and upload it for the auditor or something like that, you now know the location of this worksheet and you can find it fairly easily. So that is one of my very favorite ways to document. Again, it's pretty painless when you're doing it right along with your reconciliation. If you sit down with your staff and identify these key processes to document and they have a reconciliation work paper like this, this might be a great place for you to start working with them. So I will now stop sharing. As you go through your documentation, think in terms of organization. On that worksheet, we had that the contributions receivable was in the receivables area, and it was the responsibility of the advancement accountant. So organize your table of contents for these by both of those. So you can look both in the receivables table of contents or under the responsible position. I like to have it in both areas because the main accounting area is sort of the bigger picture, longer term view, but the responsible position is a fast way for a staff person to look up their own documentation sometime. You want to maintain these in an accessible location. They can't be on your hard drive, desktop. They need to be in a shared drive where they can be accessed by appropriate personnel. And again, to keep them correct, the responsible person needs to review this documentation at least annually. That'll keep it up to date and pertinent. And we are now on to polling question number 3. Which documentation approach do you think you might use? I've got Excel worksheets. I have an example of a Word doc of this same process, which will be in the handout for you. You can take a look at that. That one I've used tables, so it ends up being a lot like Excel, but it's more of a narrative. So, if you like words better than the Excel approach, that's fine. You can purchase documentation software or look at enlisting outside assistance. let you guys spend a little time answering that.
All right, and Cathy, we do have a question here.
Okay.
One says, what would you suggest doing if you're receiving pushback from the staff about documenting?
Pushback isn't uncommon. The first common thing I hear is, I'm too busy to do that. I don't have time. The answer to that is, this will save you time in the long run. And it's one of those things where you're just going to have to invest a little time now to get on board with it. But I think you need to believe yourself that this is an important priority, because if you're not totally on board with the idea and you're the leader of the department, you're not going to sell it very confidently. But if you can work through one of these on your own, really get buy-in from your own perspective, understand some of the challenges that you had to face so you can anticipate what that might be, you'll be able to talk more confidently to your staff about the importance of this. And then I would suggest starting with that group meeting on everybody listing out your tasks. Just say, we're going to set aside a half an hour here. Everybody's coming. It's part of our regular staff meeting, or we're having a special staff meeting. We're going to start our task lists, and we're going to choose processes to document. Just that this is important for the organization. And if you believe it and consistently convey that message, I think you'll get the message across. You do have to follow up with people. You can't assign the task list and then just sort of fades away into Neverland. You're going to have to set a schedule for yourself and follow through on it to make sure people really understand this is something you consider important.
Perfect. Thank you, Cathy. And you are good to continue.
Okay. I wanted to, since we have a little time, go through some other best practices related to documentation. Again, these are things that I've seen in my work as a CFO and as a temporary CFO and controller at Eide Bailly. So the first thing we're going to look at is what I call the random work practice. I'm getting some feedback, Mai. Is that anybody else getting that? No? Okay. The random work paper, we've all been there. This might be, and I am the first to admit it, something that I had on my desk, and I can honestly not remember what this was. It might be something that I come across in a file. It might be something somebody puts in my inbox, and I have no clue what this relates to or why, and it's going to take time for me to identify it. So I'm going to make a case right now for good work paper headers. They make life easier for everyone. They make life easier for the preparer. You know what you're working on. For the reviewer, they know what you're working on. They're certainly easier for a new person coming on board, trying to get into the cycle of your position, this new position that they've come into. And absolutely, they make life easier for auditors and tax preparers who are going to have work papers uploaded to portals and not, you know, yes, it might be filed under a certain audit checklist number on your portal, but then once you download it, what is it? Not only what is the work paper, but who's the work paper for? What organization is this? So I really want to encourage you to start looking at good work paper headers. Uniform work paper formatting, it just makes sharing work papers, transitioning duties, and reviewing easier. It also promotes a cohesive office. I mean, you think about how your company works really hard to have the same look on its documents, maybe the same font on all of its printed materials, certainly the same logo, the same color scheme. We put a lot of thought into that from the look of our organization. You can do the same thing for your office. Your work papers are going to promote a cohesive look for your office. People are going to know this is coming from the finance department. I think it shows a nice element of pride in your office too. And then finally, establishes work papers and documentations as the property of the organization, not the individual. I'm as guilty as everybody. You put together a great work paper and you think, yeah, my work paper, I did it, it's great, it's awesome. It's not my work paper. It is a work paper for the organization. And when you label it with a header of the organization and make it look like the other organizational work papers in your area, that becomes very clear. You know it's a good work paper when, I always like to say, it identifies this who, what, when, where, and why again. It says who, the organization, and the staff responsible, so you know who this work paper's for, and there's some identification of the staff person who worked on it. Talks about what it is, so it gives the name of the account and a reconciliation if it's a reconciliation balance. It tells you when, it gives you the date. Is this first quarter, second quarter, January, December? It will give you some information on where this happens in the process, the triggers that relate to it. And it should also tell you a little bit why is this work paper being done? And that might be included in the process steps, or it could be in the work paper itself. So I'm just going to go one more screen on here now and show you what I think is an example of a clean work paper. Got the name of the organization, U.S. University, the name of the account that we're reconciling here, contributions receivable, and I even have the general ledger account up there too to make it easy if the person's reviewing and they want to compare this, the date it's being reconciled as, and prepared by. So now we've got the who, the what, the when, and the where. We didn't really talk about where it's at in the process, but we do know it's at year end is the reconciliation. And we've got all of our information that we had looked at earlier on that reconciliation work paper. This means adding 3 or 4 lines at the top of every work paper. Oh gosh, yeah, that's a lot of work. But now you've got consistent looks to your work papers, you've got consistent data and information, and they are easily identifiable and make it much easier for your reviewer and your external auditor and tax preparer. The next thing I want to talk about that just backs up good documentation in your office is your worksheet file organization. And again, we've all been there way too many times. Where did I save that work paper? Where did Dick, Jane, Sally, the dog save that work paper? The person who was here before me, or the person who worked on it after I did? Oh, I'm sorry, that's on my desktop, which is a big pet peeve of mine. And another one, oh, that's in my folder. Organizations that don't have their accounting information in shared drives organized by fiscal periods, but have them organized by individual people. That's great if the people never change and everybody understands exactly what all the different people do, which is almost never the case. So when you have these sorts of situations, oh, I guess first of all, we get another polling question. Woohoo! Polling question number 4. Do you think you'll proceed with documenting accounting processes at this time? Yeah, I'm ready. Yay, let's go. Not sure or no.
And there's another polling question, Q&A question. Do you have any recommendations about how to organize the procedures? For example, FIXXX for finance.
I like to set up a table of contents in advance. And so I will organize it starting chiefly. A lot of times what I'll do is just follow the balance sheet. So I'll do like asset accounts and liability accounts, processes, income and expense accounts. And then I think I mentioned that I also then like to do another organization, which is by the staff person responsible for that area. So you'll have like your key reconciliations for maybe a bank account reconciliation, that contributions receivable. Maybe you'll have, you know, how you do your life insurance, or if you have annuities, you know, different payables, liabilities, things like that. Maybe your net asset roll forward, which is another key reconciliation work paper that it's good to document a process for. And then the same thing for income and expenses. You're going to capture some of your key revenue and expense processes in that. So if you follow that sort of format to lay everything out, and then look at your audit walkthroughs and see if there are any other processes that you missed going along that. So start with that kind of a layout, and then do the second organization of the same processes by staff person. Now you can look it up in both places. Probably the CFO is going to look it up more based on the balance sheet, and the staff person will look it up more based on the staff person.
All right, and then there is another one. What are some common process documentation software?
You know, that we're not going to cover those specifically here because those can be very specific to each individual organization. So if you're interested in following up on that, we have a question at the end if you'd like somebody to reach out to you, and we can sure talk with you more specifically with something that would be appropriate for your organization. You can find a lot of different freebies out there. You know, I have people contact me all the time and say, hey, use this, hey, use this. Again, I'm a big fan of get started manually first and kind of just figure out in your head what you want to do, how you want to do it, and how you want to organize it. And then when you start looking at softwares or talking to somebody about softwares, you're going to have the parameters in mind to make a better selection.
All right, and we are good to continue.
Okay, great. So back to work paper organization. People saving files all the heck over the place and you don't know where they're at and what are you going to do? There are some key features of a good filing system. And I think if you think back to the days when we all had, not all of us, but people in my generation had file drawers, and at least physically you had a limited number of areas to look. With computer files now, it could be all over the place. And I think it's even more risky if you don't have a good methodology in place for your organization. So key features for a good filing system: it needs to be accessible to the appropriate staff. It cannot be on your desktop. It probably should not be in a file folder with just your name on it, especially if you are password protecting that file folder. It needs to have a defined methodology for filing so that they're easy to locate. Get everybody together and say, hey, here's how we're going to file these guys. I mean, back in the day, again, when you had file drawers, A, B, C, D, alphabetical was the filing methodology. Now it's a little bit more complex, so you're going to need to sit down and agree on that filing methodology. And I'll give you my thoughts on best practices for that in a little bit. And then you also need to clearly and consistently name your files within your file structure. As you're going through this process, I think you need to very gently remind everybody that finance documentation belongs to the organization, not to the individual preparing the work paper. And that is a big mindset to overcome, but it's key to changing this process. Best practices on finance office file organization. I like to file financial statement related documents by fiscal year. And then under that fiscal year, I like to use fiscal periods for each of the months of the year. If it's a non-monthly work paper that relates to that fiscal year, for example, fixed assets, some people keep all of their fixed asset additions and deletions in one file folder under their fiscal year folder. So if your fiscal year ends December 31 of 2023, you're going to have a January, February, March, April, etc. folder for all your monthly reconciliations. Then you'll have a file maybe for your fixed assets. Maybe you'll have a file for the new leases that came up that year. You can have things outside of your monthly folders, but if it relates to your monthly financial statements and the reconciliations that back up the numbers on those financial statements, it should go in that monthly folder, as should a copy of the final financial statements for that month. So that's kind of the first general rule. Then use the subfolders within each of those fiscal periods for the individual work papers. If you have many of them, if you have 15 bank accounts, you probably want a folder under your January monthly folder for your bank reconciliations. Same thing for investments. Now, this is an area where if you have one accountant who does all the bank recs, then that folder becomes kind of their domain, so to speak. It's just not saved under, Dick, Jane, or Sally's name. It becomes the bank rec folder. So when the CFO needs to look at a bank rec, or somebody else needs to reference a bank rec, or you need to upload a bank rec for your auditors, you can go to that file folder and find what you need right away. So if you have lots of different accounts, bank accounts, investment accounts, then use a subfolder to keep those tidy in your January folder. If you don't, if you have one of each, you can just keep them as files saved in your January folder. You want to choose a uniform naming convention. So for example, if you have a FY folder, you're going to want your 06/30/2023 or 6.30.2023 or whatever you come up with, just be consistent. And then under that, you'll have your fiscal period of July. And then under that, you'll have your bank reconciliations subfolder or the bank reconciliations themselves. And again, the clear and consistent naming rules for each work paper. Here I have month, date, year. But then down here I have month, date, year. Oh, oops. Choose one and be consistent, because they will then flow in proper order. They will alphabetize appropriately, and you're going to be able to find things much more easily. Again, one location for your year-end work papers used for the financials. Those financials are very important for your organization. They are the captured history of your organization. And all of the numbers that back up those financials need to be in one place, so you always have that documentation properly accounted for. If you have need to password protect HR work papers, that's fine. I would still recommend they either be in this folder or you have some reference to where they are in HR. Label incomplete work papers. If you're working on something and it's not done, label it as a draft. And then once you're done and you have a final work paper, move it to a separate subfolder of drafts or delete it when the final version is saved. Same thing when you revise a work paper. It's fine to have your your contributions receivable June 30th, 2023, and then the auditor points out something you might want to change, and then you have contributions receivable revised. You can save both of those because both were submitted to the auditor, but make sure that you have the revised and then the date in there. And you might find that you have multiple revisions to those, which is fine. That in itself probably is identifying a process issue, something that you missed on the first work paper and then maybe missed again on the second work paper. Now you can look at that whole series of work papers the next year end and say, oh, whoops, I should remember to do this and this and this before I make that work paper final. So that those revised histories are not necessarily a bad thing. And then here's what a finance drive example might look like. You've got your finance drive over here, and you've got one file for contracts. Those span multiple fiscal years. So we're going to keep those outside of fiscal year folders. But anything backing up financial statements is going in my FY folders right here. Internal control walkthroughs, I'm putting those in a separate folder too, because then they're easy to find and update periodically throughout the year. And then within the fiscal year folders here, you can see my FY23. You can see how I set up my individual months underneath there. When you have fiscal periods that are not calendar, I like to do this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I just think it's much easier. Otherwise, you're going to alphabetize and it just makes things harder to identify. So just a quick summary then of everything we've talked about now today. I really hope you can start to see that investing now in your accounting process documentation is going to have huge short and long-term paybacks. You're going to understand things, your staff will understand things, transitions will be much easier than they were in the past. You can start small and build. You can choose one per month for each of your staff to document. Choose the biggest, scariest, the most complex, but choose one and get a process going and stick to it. Help your staff out by getting some templates put together and discuss different approaches. Have another get together after you've been working on this a little while so that people don't have to feel like it's such a big foreign, uncomfortable thing. Adopt those consistent work paper headers and templates. That's something you can do right away. And then adopt a good methodology for filing your work papers and your documentation. So there it is. Guys, I hope I've helped you understand just why this has become something that I'm pretty passionate about and I actually enjoy doing now. And I will honestly say I did not enjoy doing it when I started out, but I see so many benefits that I hope that you are seeing some of those now too. Are there any other questions we can answer?
There are, and also everyone, we have about 11 minutes left. Please make sure if you have any questions or comments, place them in the Q&A box. And one of our questions, what do you recommend for a monthly, weekly checklist?
A monthly, weekly checklist should start, think in terms of how do I do my financials? So usually what I see at the very top is bank reconciliations. So think about the steps that your staff walk through in order for the financial statements to get done. And then just write those down. So it's like bank reconciliations. Now it's maybe investment reconciliations. Maybe it's AP cutoff and reconciliation to the general ledger. All of those major items that you are reconciling to do your financial statements every month should go on a checklist. Then the other things that go on checklists are any report filings. So look where in the process of all these accounting steps do those report deadlines fall. Sales tax obviously isn't going to happen until you've got all of your recording done for the month. You're not going to be doing your payroll processing until the final payroll is done for the month, your payroll reports. So now add in to your monthly checklist the report deadlines. And that's where I said, if you work with your staff on their staff task lists, you're going to start seeing all the reports that they do and when they're due. So I build my monthly checklist from that. When I go to the quarterly checklist, I simply have another tab that says in a worksheet, for example, that adds in additional steps you do at quarter end. So at quarter end, you're probably going to do all the monthly stuff too. But now at quarter end, you might do some other reports that only come every quarter, or there might be a reconciliation, like maybe you only reconcile your pledges every quarter. So add in the steps that you just do for that quarter. And then when you get to year end, there will be yet another list of steps. And that year-end checklist should probably include everything that's requested from your auditor. If they're asking for a reconciliation or some kind of documentation, it belongs in your year-end checklist. So that's kind of how I build my monthly, quarterly, and annual ones.
Thank you. And another one, if you record the procedures in a spreadsheet with, is it Recon?
Reconciliation? Mm-hmm.
Yes. With Recon, how would you put this in a table of content? Would the Recon be included, or do you recommend just have a folder with just the procedures?
I would absolutely print off that reconciliation. That's one of the reasons I put the file name at the bottom of that process tab, because now you've got the documentation in with all of your other documentation, which might be Word docs, or it might be, snips and cuts and pastes of steps or something like that. So definitely print a copy off and put it in a binder all together. And I still keep a one binder for the processes that's hard copy, just because I think it's very easy to know if it's updated or not. So absolutely keep it all together in there and just reference it as, it's under the receivables area as it was on the documentation. And then the responsibility was that advancement account. So absolutely keep a copy of it in there, but you also know by that file location that it is right in with the reconciliation work paper.
Okay, does that go with this question? We have all of our account reconciliations in one Excel spreadsheet. Would you recommend this, or is it better to have a separate reconciliation work paper for each account?
It depends, I guess, on the size of the organization and the number of staff working on that spreadsheet. If you have multiple staff working on a spreadsheet, I would recommend splitting it out, just for sheer ease of access purposes. And then also when you're looking for a reconciliation, if you have 50 tabs at the bottom of this one reconciliation spreadsheet, obviously it's going to make that information hard to find. So think of it in terms of if you were filing papers, when would you set up a separate file folder for those papers? When you get like 10 papers, maybe you want to separate them into 2 file folders. So think in terms of the size of the documentation that's in that one Excel spreadsheet, and then also the number of people who need to access it.
Thank you. And another one, if you work with outside accountants for some things, would you include them in your processes as well?
If they are doing processes for you, then yes, you would want to understand what they are doing to the extent. So if they are, for example, I'm thinking in terms of they're reconciling your bank accounts for you, you would at least want to reference in your bank account reconciliation, bank accounts are reconciled by our outside accounting service. And then you could, have them list the steps that they do. But basically, as long as you have that process listed that your outside service is handling the bank reconciliations for you, now any individual steps in that process, you can always go back to the accounting organization and get those, as could your auditors. So probably a simple reference to that process is being handled by. But from your standpoint, if you're a CFO or the head of that organization, you might just want to understand a little bit how that process works, just for your own big picture understanding of the organization. Conversation would be great.
Okay, and are there any templates for the documentation?
Yes, they are in the handout that Mai is posting or has shared with you.
I thought so. I wanted to double check if they were referring to something else. So the examples are in your handout. You can look in your related content box and it says presentation handout link. Go ahead and click on that. You'll be able to download the PowerPoint slides, and the examples are towards the end of the pages. And then another question is, what's the best way to handle ADHOC reports that are not repeated with any time frame?
ADHLC as in
HOC.
AD what? I'm sorry.
ADHOC.
ADH, oh, ad hoc reports.
Okay.
Well, if they are not done on any specific time frame, then they probably would merit their own little section in the table of contents. So you're going to have your things organized, as I mentioned, by the different financial areas, and then you could have a section that's at other reports, and that would capture anything that didn't fall into the other areas.
Okay, and then we have, I see the importance of documenting as it allows you to identify areas and to streamline or eliminate duplications of tasks. Oh, I guess that was just a comment.
Great.
And
Absolutely.
then any recommendations for organizations who work with an outsourced accounting service provider or bookkeeper? Should we work on the documentation together? Should we expect to have them have things documented, or should we expect them to have things documented already?
If you're working with an outside accounting organization, they will have the documentation for how they're doing things. So as we mentioned, you might want to just say if in your documentation table of contents, bank reconciliations are prepared by an outside accounting service. So document the things that you're doing in your own organization, refer to the ones that you have outsourced. And then at some point in time, if you get to a growth point where you decide you're going to add a staff person and transfer some of those outsourced duties in-house, that would be a time for you to sit down with your outsourced accounting firm and say, hey, we're going to take this back on ourselves. We want to work through a good process for it. Can you guide us in that?
Okay. Let me look. All right, what about reports 5500 related to 403B? Should those be filed in the FYE folders or a separate folder?
You can do them either way. Usually what I do is I do put them in the FY folder because you'll have one every fiscal year, but they would merit their own folder outside of a monthly. Some people put them in with their year end, but a lot of other times you'll see those retirement plan, benefit plan folders, they'll be in a separate folder. So you can have like your 5500s or even just name them, a folder for each individual kind of benefit report. But I would keep them in with the fiscal year folders. If you're going to be looking for one of those 5500 forms, and this is just a general rule for that file organization anyway, where would I start looking? You'd probably start looking within the year. You're going to be looking for a 5500 for a certain fiscal year. So that would be a good clue about how to organize it.
All right, and it looks like that is the end of content questions, and we have a lot of people that really enjoyed your presentation, Cathy, and another person is saying thanks, Cathy. Nice job.
You're welcome. Well, and those were great questions, you guys. So thank you so much for those. Very thoughtful and perceptive.